I had never really given silence much thought. While others found it unsettling or even creepy, I had always seen it as a source of peace. It was in those quiet hours after a long day when everything slowed down, or in the gentle stillness before falling asleep next to the woman I had loved for more than 10 years. Silence had always felt safe. It had never let me down, until that one night. It was late, much later than usual. I had been sitting in my parked car for nearly an hour, right outside the house I had spent years building with my own hands. I kept telling myself I wasn't avoiding going inside, but something deep inside held me back. Lynette and I hadn't had a big fight, not exactly, but things had shifted between us. There was a chill in the air that hadn't been there before. It felt like we were coexisting under the same roof, living side by side, but not together. I tried to blame it on the stress of everyday life, the routines that wear down even the strongest bonds. I thought it was just one of those phases that couples go through. Yet something about that night, something I couldn't quite put into words, made me pause before walking in. When I finally stepped through the door, I did it as quietly as possible, slipping off my shoes near the entrance. The house was mostly dark, with only the kitchen light casting a soft glow into the hallway. Then I heard a voice, a quiet murmur that made me stop in my tracks. Lynette was talking on the phone. I shouldn't have listened. That's not who I was. I wasn't the kind of man who eavesdropped. But there was something in her tone, secretive and tense, that made me uneasy. I stayed still and strained to hear. What I heard next crushed everything I believed about us. I hate being with him. Those words hit me like a punch to the chest. I couldn't breathe. My world tilted as I listened, unable to look away or move. It's exhausting. Every single day, I feel trapped. If I had the courage, I'd leave and never come back. My heart pounded so violently I was afraid she'd hear it. There was no mistaking what she meant. She was talking about me. This wasn't a slip made in anger, not some dramatic outburst in the middle of a disagreement. This was honest. It was real. It was how she truly felt. For years, I thought we were still building something together. I believed we were just weathering a difficult period. I was convinced that, deep down, she still cared for me. But standing there, bathed in the dull light of our hallway, I had to face the horrible truth. This marriage had become a one-sided effort. And maybe it had been that way for longer than I realized. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, every part of me unwilling to accept what I'd just heard. I tried to convince myself I had misheard, that maybe she was talking about someone else. Maybe a coworker? Or a friend? Some family member I didn't know? But no. Her voice was too clear, too sure. The sorrow in her tone was unmistakable. She didn't want to be with me anymore. A cold shiver crept up my spine. I wanted to walk into the kitchen right then, to confront her, to ask her why. But my body refused to move. I stood there, gripping the doorframe as though it might hold me up, listening as she continued. I know, she said with a weary sigh. I should have ended it a long time ago. But it's complicated. The house, the money. It's not that easy. My stomach clenched. This wasn't just a passing frustration. She had considered leaving. Maybe she had even planned it. The only thing stopping her wasn't love or loyalty. It was convenience. Practicality. I was no longer her partner. I was a complication. I felt the walls closing in around me. My fists clenched until my fingernails dug into my palms, trying to ground myself. She went on speaking, not knowing that each word was driving the blade deeper. I just need a little more time. I don't want to hurt him. I want to be sure. Be sure of what? Whether she could find someone better. Whether staying was worth the sacrifice. The questions swirled in my mind, and my chest felt like it might cave in. For years, I had given her everything. My energy, my devotion, my hopes for the future. I thought we were in it together. I thought she still believed in us. But the truth was devastating. She had been quietly deciding whether I was worth the trouble of walking away. Without even thinking, I turned and headed back toward the front door. My movements were automatic, like I had disconnected from myself. I had to leave. I needed air, space, a chance to think. I slipped outside and shut the door behind me, the cold night air slapping me into awareness. It was quiet, an unbearable, suffocating quiet. Before I knew it, my legs had carried me to the car. I sank into the driver's seat, clutching the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. I could have gone back. I could have demanded answers, made her face me and admit what she really felt. But some part of me wasn't ready to hear it aloud. So I did the only thing that felt right at that moment. I turned the key, started the engine, and drove. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just kept going, letting the soft hum of the car and the streaks of light passing by tether me to reality. My thoughts spun in chaotic circles, her words repeating endlessly in my head like a broken record. I hate being with him. If I had the courage, I'd leave and never look back. I just need a little more time. How long had she been harboring these feelings? Was this a recent shift, or had she been hiding her true emotions for months, or even years? Had I been deluding myself all this time, assuming we were just navigating a difficult phase? My jaw clenched as I gripped the steering wheel with such force that a dull ache spread through my arms. The idea that she might have been pretending smiling at me over dinner, kissing me goodnight, waking beside me each morning while secretly dreading it all made my stomach churn. I found myself pulling into an empty parking lot behind a shuttered diner. The neon sign that once promised open 24 hours now flickered weakly, casting a ghostly glow across the lot. I killed the engine and leaned back, resting my head against the seat. A slow breath escaped my lips. My fingers still trembled. I had no clue how far I'd driven or how much time had passed. None of it seemed to matter. The only thing that felt real was the sharp, undeniable truth pressing down on me. Lynette didn't love me anymore. Or perhaps she once had, but that version of our story was long gone, faded like a memory I didn't realize was slipping away. I dragged a hand through my hair, trying to make sense of the whirlwind in my head. What was I supposed to do now? Head back home and pretend I'd never overheard anything? Just wait for the day she finally found the strength to leave? Or should I pack a bag and vanish, letting her wake up alone to figure it out on her own? Neither option felt right. Neither choice felt like me. I was never the kind of man who gave up easily. I'd always fought for what mattered to me. No, I wasn't flawless, but I never stopped trying. Still, how do you fight for someone who has already decided they're done with you? That truth hit me hard, sinking deep into my chest like a heavy weight. I had already lost her. I just hadn't realized it until tonight. The thought of walking back into our home right now felt unbearable. I couldn't imagine facing her, not without hearing her voice repeating those words in my head. As if summoned by the storm inside me, a sharp knock on my car window made me jump. I turned, startled, my heart pounding wildly. An older man, likely in his early 60s, stood just outside my door. His face was tired, lined with the wear of a long life. His work clothes, a worn button-up shirt and a grease-smudged apron, told me he was employed at the diner. He motioned for me to lower the window. I hesitated before rolling it down just a crack. "You all right there, son?" His voice was raspy, either from years of smoking or from life wearing him down. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Because no, I wasn't all right. Not even close. But how do you tell a complete stranger something like that? Instead, I nodded stiffly. "Yeah, just needed a minute." He studied me for a few seconds, then gave a small shrug. "You just looked like a guy buried under something heavy. Thought I'd check in." He turned to go, but I stopped him with a question that tumbled out before I could second-guess myself. "Hey, have you ever been married?" He paused, looked over his shoulder with a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. 32 years, he said at last. "Lost her a couple summers back." A lump caught in my throat. "Did you ever feel like she was only staying because she didn't know how to leave?" He sighed and moved a little closer, leaning his arm casually against the frame of the car. "No," he answered softly. "But I knew some guys who did." I gripped the steering wheel again, bracing myself as he went on. They all asked themselves the same things. What did I miss? Was it something I did or didn't do? Did I change or did she? And you know what? None of them ever got a straight answer. My breath caught as I whispered, "So what do you do when you realize the person you've built your life around doesn't want to be there anymore?" He glanced toward the neon sign, now blinking like a tired pulse in the dark. "You've got a choice. Either you stay and live with the weight of knowing, or you leave before they decide for you." I sat in the silence that followed, feeling his words settle deep into my bones. Maybe I already knew what I needed to do. Maybe I just hadn't accepted it yet. I lingered in that parking lot far longer than I should have. Long enough for the older man to return to his duties inside the diner. Long enough for the sign's flicker to begin to feel like the slow rhythm of a heartbeat in the emptiness around me. Long enough to wonder how things had spiraled so far that I now sat here, stranded in the middle of nowhere, dreading the idea of walking back into my own home. I used to think I'd be able to tell. That if Lynette ever stopped loving me, there would be clear signs. The way she looked at me, the tone in her voice, the way her hand found or didn't find mine. But replaying everything now, I saw the truth. The signs had been there all along. They just hadn't looked the way I expected. She hadn't grown distant. If anything, she had stayed engaged. She still kissed my cheek when I left for work, still sent me reminders about dinner, or checked if I needed anything from the store. She still shared my bed every night, still laughed at my jokes, still talked about the future like it was something we'd share together. And that was the hardest part to swallow, because it meant she had been pretending, like she was acting out a role. She had been putting on an act, maybe for my benefit or perhaps even for her own peace of mind. And I had gone along with it, not because I was fooled, but because I desperately wanted to believe it. I needed to cling to the hope that what we were facing was nothing more than a temporary setback, just a rough spell we could overcome, like we had done before. But deep down, I now recognized the reality. She wasn't holding out hope for reconciliation. She was just waiting for the right moment to walk away. My jaw clenched as I reached for my phone. My thumb hovered over her name in the contact list. I briefly entertained the idea of calling her, telling her I wouldn't be coming home that night, cornering her into revealing what she had kept hidden. But then what? What would I gain? Her admitting it wouldn't change the truth I had already discovered. I didn't need her to voice it. I already knew what she felt. Then a new and unsettling thought began to take shape. If Lynette had been thinking about leaving, there was a chance that she hadn't just thought about it. What if she had already emotionally detached? What if she was merely waiting, preparing for her next step, with someone else? The mere possibility made my stomach tighten. I had never been the jealous kind, never doubted our bond, never felt threatened in our relationship. But now I had to question it. Could there be someone she was confiding in, someone offering her support, telling her she deserved better than me? Imagining her leaning on another man didn't just sting, it felt degrading. I shook my head, trying to collect myself, willing my breath to steady. Sitting there, getting swallowed by spiraling thoughts, wasn't going to help. I needed answers. Without giving myself a chance to reconsider, I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. But I didn't head home. My instincts guided me elsewhere. Lynette had always been discreet. If she was hiding something, she wouldn't leave behind anything obvious. But even the most careful people make small mistakes, subtle signs they don't realize they're leaving behind. And I was determined to find them. The first place I checked was the account for our shared cell phones, a setup we had created years ago back when trust between us had been a given. I brought up the call history and began scrolling through the logs, my eyes searching for anything out of the ordinary. That's when I saw it. A number I didn't recognize, appearing again and again. The calls came at strange hours, some lasting barely a minute, others stretching on for a while. There was a rhythm to it, a consistency that couldn't be ignored. My heart pounded in my chest as I copied the number into a search engine. No name came up, just a standard mobile carrier listing. But I didn't need a name to understand what this meant. This was the confirmation I hadn't wanted to find. It was proof that whatever I had been desperately clinging to in my relationship with Lynette was no longer there. I held the phone tightly, staring at the screen like the answers might suddenly materialize. My mind was a chaotic whirlwind of disbelief, anxiety, and reluctant acceptance. Every logical voice in my head tried to reason with me, suggesting I might be misinterpreting things, jumping to conclusions. But my instincts, they were shouting at me that something was seriously off. I had always believed in Lynette. Even when things between us began to change, when our talks became less meaningful, when her eyes no longer held the same warmth, I had convinced myself that it was just a phase, something we could work through. Don't all couples hit rough spots? That was the story I told myself. That was the belief I held on to. But now, staring at that unfamiliar number called over and over again, the weight of reality pressed down on me like a boulder. This wasn't just fear. It wasn't my imagination running wild. It was real. There was a pattern. She had been deliberate, and I could no longer ignore what that meant. Still, I hesitated. What if I had it wrong? What if confronting her led to some innocent explanation? Maybe this number belonged to a friend I didn't know about, or a colleague from work. I kept trying to twist the facts into something harmless, something that wouldn't hurt. But no matter how I spun it, the puzzle pieces just didn't fit. Lynette had never been one to hide things. Yet here I was, staring at something she clearly hadn't wanted me to find. I drew in a deep breath, hoping it might calm the turmoil inside me, but it did nothing to quiet the storm. My thumb hovered over the number. I could call it. I could hear the voice on the other end and maybe, just maybe, find out everything. But a quiet warning echoed in my mind. That wasn't the right move, not yet. If I truly wanted to get to the bottom of this, I had to approach it with a clear head. No emotion, just patience and strategy. I leaned back in my seat and gripped the steering wheel with both hands, grounding myself in the moment. If my suspicions were right, if Lynette really was keeping something from me, then tonight was the time to find out. So rather than heading home, I made up my mind. I decided to wait and see what she'd do when she thought no one was watching. Instead of pulling into our driveway, I left my car parked several blocks away, hidden under the weak, flickering light of the street lamps. The night felt unnaturally silent, as though the world itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. My chest was tight, my heartbeat erratic. A storm of unease and reluctant resolve settled in me. I had never been the kind of man to play detective, never once questioned Lynette's comings and goings. She had always had my trust, without hesitation. But something had changed. For the first time in our relationship, I couldn't shake the gut-wrenching sense that she was keeping something from me. From the shadows, I stayed far enough away not to be seen, but close enough to keep watch. I spotted the porch light flicker on before the front door creaked open. Lynette stepped out with a calm grace that made my insides twist. There was no trace of anxiety in her movements. She didn't check her surroundings, didn't sneak around like someone hiding something. Her confidence unsettled me. It told me this wasn't a new experience for her. She had done this before. She had changed clothes, now dressed in something far more polished than what she usually wore at home. The casual loungewear had been swapped for a fitted pair of jeans and a stylish blouse. Not flashy, but clearly chosen with purpose. She looked effortlessly put together, like someone preparing to meet someone who mattered. A cold realization washed over me. She wasn't going out to clear her head or run errands. She was trying to impress. I watched her lock the front door, walk to her car, and drive off with purpose. My hand hovered over the ignition, hesitation gripping me. I could just drive away, forget what I'd seen, pretend nothing had happened, and carry on as though everything was fine. But how could I keep waking up next to someone who might not even want to be there? No, I had to know the truth. I followed at a careful distance, keeping my headlights low and staying a few car lengths behind. She didn't make any detours, didn't pause at stoplights, didn't glance at her mirrors. There was no caution in her route. She didn't expect to be followed, because she believed there was no reason for suspicion. After around 15 minutes, the answer I dreaded revealed itself. A hotel sign lit up ahead. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I pulled into a spot across the street. I watched as she parked, stepped out, and casually adjusted her purse strap. She walked with confidence toward the entrance, each step pressing heavier on my chest. She didn't stop, didn't second-guess. She knew exactly where she was going. Then came the moment that shattered everything. Through the hotel's glass doors, I saw her approach the front desk. The receptionist greeted her with ease, like she was a familiar face. Lynette smiled, relaxed, and handed over a card. The clerk nodded, typed into the system, and gave her a keycard. No questions. No explanations needed. She had been here before. Without a pause, she made her way to the elevators. I watched the doors close behind her. I couldn't move. This wasn't speculation anymore. It was fact, cold and undeniable. The loneliness that followed hit me harder than I ever imagined possible. There I was, sitting in my car, watching the woman I had loved for so many years vanish into a space that wasn't part of our life. A place that welcomed her with open familiarity. And I felt myself unraveling. Everything I thought was solid had suddenly turned to air. I expected to feel rage, to be overwhelmed with betrayal. But none of that came. What I felt was finality. I had no desire to rush inside, to confront her, to throw accusations or demand answers. That would have been the expected response. Maybe even what she had prepared herself for, an emotional outburst, a chaotic scene that she could twist into justification. But she wouldn't get that from me. Instead, I turned the key in the ignition and pulled back onto the road. Strangely, a quiet calm settled over me. When I returned home, the house felt different, empty in a way I hadn't noticed before. It no longer felt like a home, just a structure where memories used to live. I didn't act on impulse. There was no panic, no rush to flee. I moved through the motions carefully, gathering only the essentials. It wasn't about running away. It was about moving forward. Once my bag was packed, I sat down at the kitchen counter and wrote her a note. Lynette, I know. I heard everything. I saw everything. And I understand. I won't fight for someone who no longer wants to stay. So I'm making this simple. I'm leaving. Don't worry about explaining. I don't need any. I just hope that whatever it was you were searching for, you found it, and that it was worth it. I placed the note on the counter, set the house key beside it, and gave the room one last look. Then I walked out the door without hesitation. I wasn't entirely sure where I was headed. Maybe I'd crash at Oliver's place for a while. Or maybe I'd just keep driving until I found somewhere that felt right. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't clinging to something that was already broken. I was finally letting go, and that freedom meant more than anything I'd lost. The cool night breeze brushed against my skin as I walked out the door, carrying only a duffel bag and a burden I hadn't even known I'd been shouldering for so many years. The street was still, almost indifferent, as if the world hadn't noticed the seismic shift that had just taken place in my life. It was surreal, how everything felt unchanged while I had been so completely altered in just a matter of hours. But in that quiet moment, taking in a deep breath that seemed to reach parts of me long forgotten, I understood something important. This wasn't the closing of a chapter, it was the opening of a new one. I tossed the bag onto the passenger seat, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the key in the ignition. The soft purr of the engine filled the silence, anchoring me to reality, assuring me that I was finally steering my own path. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't clinging to a hope that had long faded. I wasn't fooling myself into believing there was still love where only routine and obligation remained. As the tires rolled away from what was no longer our home, no, I corrected myself, it belonged to her now. I braced for emotions to hit me. I expected sadness, lingering regret, maybe a flicker of uncertainty. But none of those came. Instead, I felt something unexpected, relief. The invisible pressure that had been pressing on my chest for years had lifted. In its place wasn't fear, but something far more empowering, liberation. The vibration of my phone on the seat beside me pulled my gaze for just a moment. I saw her name, Lynette. The screen lit up, then dimmed again as I let it ring unanswered. What could she possibly have to say that would change anything? That she regretted it? That it wasn't what it appeared to be? That she'd made a terrible choice? No, I wasn't giving her the chance to twist the narrative. Her explanations, her apologies, whatever she had to offer, they weren't meant for me anymore. That door had closed. I kept driving, the empty road stretching forward like an open invitation. Maybe I'd crash at Oliver's place tonight. Or maybe I'd just keep going, driving until I landed somewhere that felt like it truly belonged to me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't held back by anyone else's uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, I was living a life that was truly mine. And I wasn't going to look back.